Yellow! Today we'll be using my new rec extension Map64 to build a color-based patch that sounds like this. Let's get started. We'll chuck in a combinator, and then we'll also chuck in a line mixer 6:2, a subtractor, and last but not least, we'll also use my new rec extension, the Map64 player. The first thing we'll do is we'll set this up so that whenever I hit C1 on my keyboard, Map64 sends a F#1 to the subtractor. Then we'll switch the subtractor to a square wave, bring this down to the second octave, bring the filter frequency all the way up, and let's take a listen. We can now switch the phase on the oscillator to subtract mode and then modulate it with LFO2. And we'll bring down the rate a little bit and also the amount. Next, I will add a phaser underneath the subtractor, and I'll bring the F mod all the way down, and we'll instead modulate the frequency using a CV signal from our Map64. So I will hook up the first envelope to the frequency CV on the phaser, and then we can trigger the first envelope whenever we trigger this C1 node. So let's jump into the CV editor on the Map64 and set up our first envelope on our blue envelope slot. And I will simply chuck in a mix process right here, and then on the first process slot we'll add a noise. Then we'll connect the input one of the mix to the noise slot so that we can scale it and add an offset on the second input with values like this. For now, we'll check this back later. For now, we will also increase the interpolation time on the noise so that we end up with something a little more smooth like this. And now I'll experiment a little bit using different settings for the scale and the input 2, which acts as a constant offset. The noise is a little bit too fast for me, so I will increase the interpolation time. And I'm happy with this. Next up, we will just run this through an OTT. And this is our basic bass sound. Now is kind of the time where Map64 can really shine, because we will add another instrument to this combinator that will play a chord on top of this bass. So to do this, let's add a parsec, which is Reason's additive synthesizer, which is very well suited to this task, because what we can do is we can actually use the aux, or rather the send on our mixer here. Let's bring up the aux on channel 1, and then connect the send to our parsec, which is in combinator 2, parsec audio input. So this has made this connection down here to our parsec, and we can also switch this to pre, so that the level on this mixer doesn't affect the level that gets sent to the parsec, which is just from the aux sent here. Down on the parsec, we can now use another generator, for example, sine random waves, or the other way around, wavetable random sines. This is the one that I like to use. But actually first, let's add the player to actually play the chord on top of the bass, which is our Map64. And we'll just punch in a simple chord starting on F#, just going up to the 5th, and then another F#, another 5th, and then up on top we'll use a third, a major third, and also a 7th. And then let's take a listen. So for now, we've just put these sines on top of the bass, but there's no modulation going on. To do this, let's add audio in as a modifier here, which will now use the connection that we've made previously. Then we will bring up the position a little bit on this generator. And we have this nice kind of vocody sound going. We can add a little bit more flavor to this by linking A to B and turning on engine B, and then also having one channel here with the ensemble effect going, ensemble 1. If we bring up the threshold and the detune, we'll get some watery liquid sounds. I'll bring the threshold up even more, And I will check the balance a little bit so we get more of the dry kind of vocoder sound. But we have a little bit of these drops going through the ensemble, which is a nice touch. I increase the lag a little bit and bring a little bit of release into this chord. Maybe a little less. And then we'll focus on A even more. And then we can also use Shift to change the flavor of this chord. Then up in the mix, we can change how much chord we have on top. We can also bring down the bass and only listen to the vocoded chords. But this is a pretty classic color bass kind of setup, which is made simpler using MAP64, where we can punch in the chords, and then in our sequencer we can just have a single MIDI note, which triggers all of this action. Let's make it a little bit more interesting. First, we will also run this through an OTT, because you can never have enough OTTs, which just squeezes everything together, and we can bring this level back up a little bit to make it more even. And then we will add yet another instrument. Let's use another subtractor. We'll run square waves through the filter, but we'll keep it a little bit more tight. Let's again add a MAP64 player, and this time we will punch in a little phrase, which will be triggered whenever we hit C1 here, which is the note that's selected by default in our matrix. And what we'll do is we'll just run a little sequence starting from this F sharp, then I'll switch to the next step and I'll put in a C sharp. On the next step I'll put in another F sharp, and then on the final step I will add a major third. And if we now take a listen to this, let's solo the subtractor, we get our little phrase. Let's bring up the level a little, and maybe even the filter envelope also. This is like a little arpeggio. Let's turn on loop and fast on the map, and we get our little trill on top. Let's bring down the decay on the filter env and have a little bit of a resonance, and bring up the frequency a little. And then what we can also do is just add a bit of reverb using the little RV7, and we'll just switch the mode all the way to stereo echoes. And let's see. And we get a little bit of stereo width. Let's bring in the other elements again. And this is the kind of color bass patch that we wanted to build using our MAP64s to punch in an ARP melody and also a chord and just a basic note for the bass. The benefit of using such a setup is that we can now kind of treat this combinator patch like you would treat a kind of drum machine, so that we can have different chords on different notes that don't necessarily correspond to the input note pitches. So I can just copy over the setup here on the bass to the C#1. It says C#2 here, but this is one too high. It is actually C#1 in Reason's MIDI representation. So I'll also copy the chord and the ARP. And I can do this copying by switching to the next node in the matrix while holding down Shift. So if I check back, we now also have data on C#1. But what I can do now is I can change, for example, the chord that plays on C#1. So it's not a 7th and a 3rd, but maybe instead we have a 2nd and another 5th. Which is now not very apparent. So let's make a few more drastic changes. For example, we can change the phaser automation here on the bass for this additional hit by switching this trigger to 2 and then adding another envelope here on 2. I will once again copy the setup from 1 by holding Shift and clicking, and then I will change the noise seat so we get a different shape like this one. And maybe we will also make this faster by bringing down the interpolation time and changing the initial offset here. Let's see. So now we should have two different sounding basses on C1 and C#1. And together with the rest of the setup, we get a variation in the sound. Let's try to make this chord on the variation a little bit more different to the one that was initially hitting. So let's get rid of some of the lower notes and instead use thirds down here as well. So now we have already a bit of a different setup, but I don't quite like how low the phaser frequency goes here, so I will once again just kind of push this offset a little bit. And just like this, we have a variation going, and then in the sequencer, to lay down a phrase, all we would have to do is just play our 2 notes instead of changing all of the automation and all of the chords. So something like this. Right, and all we see in the sequencer are just the triggers that are then running into the maps, which take care of the automation and playing back the chords and arps for our patch. So I hope you got an idea why this player might be useful for production in this genre and others as well. If you have any questions, let me know. Other than that, have a good one of whatever you are having.